Much like baking, gardening is a great British institution. Every United Kingdom citizen has at least 2 gardens and takes great pride in taking care of them. I have once been in a talk about gardening performed by Chas Hodges, who's promoting his new book in Luton Library. If you don't know what any of these are because you're not British, please look up Chas and Dave, Luton and libraries. You might learn a great deal, but let's not dawdle and go outside and visit a great British garden. As you can see, we're in a typical British garden. There's some tarpaulin here, some wooden things, bramble, plastic rubbish. Whew, it's cold, it's really cold. Well, I'm going home. You do what you like. I'm going home. Now, in my mind, there are 2 kinds of people in the world. Those who romanticize gardening and those who actually have one and know how bloody difficult it is. But I can't blame you, especially if you live somewhere in a steel block tower in Bermondsey. Also, look up Bermondsey. You might want something holistic and beautiful and just balanced and healing right outside your back door. But what if you don't want to do any of the work, or you haven't got the space, or just want to stay out inside where it's warm and not raining? Well, in that case, my friend, you should be playing Cottage Garden. Cottage Garden comes from Uwe Rosenberg. Now, if you're new to board games and you haven't necessarily heard of Mr. Rosenberg, then all you need to know is that Uwe is known for his worker placement games that initially came in boxes about this size and then progressed onto something this size, and then eventually that was enough and we get something like this. Now, there isn't any need for a board game to be this big, but more on that in another video. So it's nice to see something fairly light and breezy from this acclaimed cardboard inventor. But light and breezy doesn't mean airy and vapid. There's quite an interesting little game going on here that can offer something to a person who's into strategic games, but also to someone who's new to board games, because it is fairly accessible. But on top of that, rounding out that package is the beautiful components that are completely unnecessary, but more than awesome. Just look at this cardboard 3D wheelbarrow, and you can put your cat tokens in there and you can go meow when you pour them out, and there's 3 types of cat tokens. If you're thinking that these tiles look a little bit like an elaborate Tetris puzzle, you're not wrong, but these pre-printed flower tiles are just gorgeous. And look at these wonderful flowers, the Mary Pipers and the Focaccias and the Iggy Azaleas, but the artwork on them largely almost doesn't matter. It's really how you place them on your 2 gardens. So whenever your turn comes, you will move this die forward, and then you'll have a row of tiles to choose from. You'll simply pick one and very easily slot one into the available spaces in your garden, trying not to cover up any flower pots or clutches. What could be more, can't really go out the board. If I maybe if I replace this tile with a different one and just this goes, no, this covers up that. Oh, this is bad. No, give up. Now, look, this tile choosing mechanism might seem a little bit simple, but actually it isn't. It's quite devastatingly devious. Imagine this board like a waiter that saunters up to you with a smorgasbord of theirs and says, "Hey, pick anything that you like, you can have one thing." But then when you pick your thing, someone else on the table will get to pick another thing, and then when your turn comes back, you'll get to pick a thing, and then they'll get to pick a thing, and then it keeps going, and you think to yourself, well, gosh, golly, if I have this steak, then my opponent will be able to have this cheese, and then will I be able to have the cheese when my turn comes round back to here? I don't know, I really want the cheese, but what about the tiger prawns? I really need the tiger prawns. And you keep calculating where your turn is going to be, and you keep estimating what you can take away from your opponent and what you can keep alive in here on the board. But on top of that, if you make too many tiles disappear from your opponent's rows, when they come to that row, if there's only 1 or 0 tiles available, they'll get to refresh it and put all new tiles onto the board, making their choice pretty delicious. When you fill up your garden with tiles, You will then count the number of visible flower pots and cloches and score points for them. Each flower pot is worth a point and each cloche is worth 2 points. And then you'll take away that garden tile and get an entirely new one and start over again. And in that, Cottage Garden manages to be fairly forgiving, because if you've covered up a flower pot with one of your tiles, it's not the end of the world, especially if the tile is pretty big. 1 point in the grand scheme of things isn't really the end of the world, and you get to complete that garden sooner if you plonk an especially big lumbersome one. But let's say that you are in a situation where you have simply a single tile spot available. Well, then you can, instead of taking a turn, take a flower pot token and just fill it in, and that gets you an extra point. It's not very efficient because it's very small, but instead of taking an action, what you can also do is you can put a cat in your garden, and everyone knows that cats makes gardens better, and that cat counts as a tile, and your garden is complete. But that's not the only thing that cats are useful for. Remember I mentioned reaching a row that has a bunch of empty spaces and then you refill it with available tiles? Well, you can trigger that refill early, even if you haven't got plenty of spaces open, simply by spending a cat, and then you take the next available tile and put it here, and you are able to choose it. And that could be pretty relevant, especially when you're able to complete your garden tile with that one tile that you just need. See, this game's quite interesting, and there's quite a lot to think about, and there's quite a lot to do. And I didn't even mention the silly point scoring system. And trust me when I say this point system scoring thing is quite silly. Every garden tile can be filled in such a way where only placing a couple of flower tiles will complete the entire thing. And if you manage to find the right tiles for these spots, feels incredibly satisfying. But then you will count up the total number of orange points and blue points that you get from it and move these cubes correspondingly. But in this case, if we're scoring 7 points from this tile, we don't actually want to move this cube because it can only have a movement of 4, and then it stops, and we can only move 1 cube with the points that we score. So instead of moving this one, we actually might want to move that one all the way up to here, which would net us an extra cat for crossing this line. And whilst it's a somewhat finky mechanic, because towards the end of the game you'll be trying to find tiles with just the right number of points so you can push your cube into that 20 space, and it feels interesting, but very much bolted on. You see, just like you're filling in these little garden tiles and finding the right spaces to fill up, it's the same with the design of this game. It felt like that point mechanism just was added to kind of round out the game. And whilst it makes perfect, complete sense, it isn't in any way engaging or really very interesting. And it's not the real only problem with Cottage Garden. You see, the rulebook that you get in this first edition, it is, well, pretty, but not very spectacular in terms of clarity. And some rules, for me, for this very simple game, still remain ever so slightly unclear. It is by far not the worst rulebook that I've read in my life, but I just wished it was a little bit better. You might say these criticisms are a little bit petty, and yes, I agree with you, they are. Here's the thing though, if I was introducing someone new to board games, I would break out Cottage Garden without breaking a sweat. It would get here from my shed to this table faster than you could say the word cat. But real games deserve real critique. And here's a little bit of critique that Cottage Garden might not enjoy so much. It blends elements of strategy and tactics together. So for example, on the tactics side, you have this board and how you choose the tiles, and you might choose the particular tile to deny someone another tile, and then you want to ensure that you'll get a certain tile. And then you have these garden tiles where you're trying to build a strategy of how you're actually going to put the tiles onto it and which ones you're going to get later. But none of those elements, neither tactics nor strategy, are particularly deep. And if you're a fan of deep strategic or deep tactical games, Cottage Garden might just not be enough for you. And here's another little thing. Whilst I do enjoy playing Cottage Garden whilst I'm playing it, when I'm not playing Cottage Garden, I don't have a particular hankering to break it out. Unless someone is going to specifically ask me to play Cottage Garden, I just don't see it coming out that often. And that's unfortunately damning praise for a game that I think is pretty good. So there you go. That's the board game industry these days.
My mama cooks in Italy. My mama's was in Venezuela. Mama likes Cinderella. Mama's got a chumba,
New to board games if you've never heard of Misty Rosenberg. Misty? Misty Rosenberg. Huh.